All right, everybody. You're tuned into Random Radio. Welcome to another exciting episode of Just Ask, the podcast where you ask the questions, we give you the answers. I'm Nicholas John Random, your host, and today's question is all about Doctor Who. I know we got some Whovians out there, so this should be a pretty fun one. Now, our question today is coming from Jill. Jill says that she and her boyfriend are big sci-fi fans, and they love getting together and watching Star Trek and Star Wars and sci-fi of all kinds. But she is a huge Doctor Who fan, and she can't seem to get her boyfriend to give it a shot. So, her question is, how do you explain Doctor Who to American nerds? Well, I think I'm going to enjoy this one. I know a lot about this subject. Not only am I a huge nerd, sci-fi nerd, I've seen just about everything you can imagine when it comes to sci-fi. I've worked in the movie industry. I've worked at movie theaters, video stores, and seen everything you can possibly imagine when it comes to sci-fi. So I know a little bit about this subject, and specifically this subject right here: how to explain Doctor Who to American nerds. This is an important one. I think this one actually needs to get out there. I think it is important because I have to be honest with you. I was one of these American nerds who'd seen every episode and movie of Star Trek ever made. I've seen all the Star Wars, with the exception of now Disney's taken over and they've kind of gone a little crazy with these shows. They just keep spitting them out. But, I've seen most of the Star Wars. I've seen literally everything you can imagine when it comes to sci-fi television and movies. So I've dipped my toes in the sci-fi world, and even myself, it took me a really, really, really long time to watch Doctor Who, to give Doctor Who a shot. And that's for a number of reasons, and that's what we're going to talk about today. And I'm gonna see if I can try and convert some American nerds to just give it a shot, because I got to tell you, as a sci-fi guy, and as a guy who took a really, really long time to watch Doctor Who finally, Doctor Who is now one of my favorite sci-fi shows that has ever existed, ever. And it continues to air, and I continue to eat it up, and I want to keep watching it. Even, with all shows, you're going to have some bad stuff here and there, but it's great. I love the whole thing. I've gone back and watched all of the originals from the 60s on to today. I've seen it all, and I love all of it. It's great. It's fantastic. So, where do we begin? Well, how do we begin? Because, again, this is a podcast that if I'm lucky enough to catch some of those Americans who are thinking about watching Doctor Who, don't know enough about it, I don't want to bore them right off the beginning. So I'm going to say a couple of things right off the bat. First off, I got to put out that one special thing that we all have to say these days: spoiler alert. Okay, I have no filter. If you've listened to these podcasts, you know that I have no filter. I'm going to say whatever that comes off the top of my mind. That's how these podcasts work. I like them live, and I like them to just be me rambling. We might as well call them random rambles, except I can't say that very, very well over and over again. So I'm not going to say it at the beginning of every podcast. That's why it's named Just Ask. But I have no filter. I'm going to say whatever I feel like, and when it comes to things that I like, I'm going to talk about them. So odds are there's going to be spoilers. But if you're a real fan of sci-fi, you can hear a few spoilers here and there, and it's not going to ruin the show for you. It's not going to ruin the movie for you. You can hear a couple things, and it might even make you interested. Like, oh, I didn't know that was going on in that show. Maybe I'll watch it now. So I'm going to say spoiler alert. Spoiler alert, everybody. If you haven't seen some things, I will try my best to keep it vague, but I may spoil some things. So just saying that just in advance. Second thing I always have to say, everything on this podcast that I say is my opinion only. So don't freak out, everybody. It's just one guy's opinion. Now, where do we start? I don't want to bore anybody with a bunch of facts about Doctor Who. I'll throw some facts in there later, but let's see. How do we get you guys to understand just how exactly Doctor Who has become one of the greatest sci-fi television shows ever, and yet a lot of Americans don't give it a shot. Well, let's talk about my experience first. So my experience, like I said, I grew up watching sci-fi. I grew up watching the original series of Star Trek especially. I love Star Trek, and I'm not a Trekkie. I'm a sure, I've been to a couple Comic Cons, but that's because I had a lot of friends who were comic book artists actually. But I'm not a Trekkie by any means. I'm not a Star Trek, one of those people who dresses up in Trek and goes to the comic conventions. I enjoy all that stuff, and I have a lot of Trekkie friends. And yes, I have seen every single episode of Star Trek ever made, including all the new weird shows that they've got now, including all the movies. And I love it all. It's fantastic. Having said that, here's an explanation for one of the reasons I didn't start watching Doctor Who until recently. I have a thing about myself, and I know a lot of other people have this, especially these days with streaming, and we have all these apps out now, Amazon and Disney Plus and Hulu and Netflix and all this stuff. It's super easy to binge watch shows and just go through an entire series or several series of an entire show. You can run through 5 or 6 seasons of a show, over a couple of weeks, which didn't used to be the case. But it has made it a lot easier, and this problem more relevant. I don't like to not leave a story. I don't like to leave a story unfinished. I like to see it all. I don't, even if it's bad, even if it's a bad ending of a book or a movie or a TV show or anything like that, I want to read all. Like if there's 3 books, I want to read all 3 of those books, even if the first one was the only one that's good. And I can tell you that's happened a couple of times. My favorite example of this is Dirk Gently's Holistic Detective Agency is one of my favorite books by an author called Douglas Adams. Most people know him because he wrote Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, that series of books. Well, Dirk Gently's Holistic Detective Agency, great, amazing, ridiculous book. The way Douglas Adams writes is just so crazy. You're just doing loop-de-loops in like your head. It's one of the only styles of writing that you literally have to reread a sentence sometimes 3 or 4 times just to know just to understand what he was saying. And not because he uses complicated words or anything like that. It's just, he just has a crazy way of writing. If you've read his stuff, you understand. But anyway, Dirk Gently's Holistic Detective Agency is one of my favorite books of all time, not just his. And it's a small, short little book. He made 2 other books to go with that series. He made a book called The Long Dark Tea Time of the Soul, which is the second book, and a third book. The second book was awful. It was just terrible. And the way it's written, I have a feeling that the editors had a lot to do with why it was terrible, but it was not good. Like the first book was written, in the 80s, and Douglas Adams was a phenomenal writer, and they just let him have free reign. The second book was written much later, and I feel like the editors were getting down his throat at that point, and they were like, nope, we got to cut this out. Nope, we got to cut this out. And it was an awful book. And the third book, he started writing, and then he passed away, and somebody ghost writ the end of it, which was terrible. You can't really do that. So, but this is an example of, even though the first book was the only one that was good, I still had to read those other 2 books just because I had to finish that series. That's how my brain works. And I know a lot of sci-fi guys have the same thing. You watch Star Trek, you got to watch all the Star Treks. So when it comes to Doctor Who specifically, I think a lot of Americans who look at Doctor Who and do any kind of, like you Google Doctor Who and you do any kind of research and you find out that Doctor Who is the longest single storyline show to air on TV ever. Which means there are so many episodes. So many episodes of Doctor Who. It is ridiculous. Doctor Who was first aired in 1963. Just to give you guys a perspective, you American guys out there, Star Trek was first aired in 1966. So Doctor Who came out 3 years earlier. Also, just so you have another reference, Star Trek is especially when it originally came out, is a pretty straightforward show. It's a show about guys in the future who are on a military ship flying around space exploring. You know, it's pretty self-explanatory. Doctor Who, in contrast, is a wackadoo show created 3 years earlier about an alien who flies around in a spaceship and travels through space and time in multiple dimensions. That's crazy, crazy science fiction stuff that came out years before Star Trek did. But again, I think one of those things that keeps Americans specifically from watching it is that fact. They look at it and they realize that there's oh man, there's been 13 doctors and there's been hundreds and hundreds of episodes. You know, if I get into it, where do I even start first off? And then how do we, how do I watch all that? Where do I find the time to watch all that stuff? You know, that's a long one. Like, I can get into a new show like Stranger Things when it pops on because it's brand new and there's only 40 episodes maybe. I don't even know. That's total random guess. There's 4 seasons, so that's a guess. But I think that is the first marker. I think that's one of the things that that's one of the things that kept me, because I know how I am and I know I like to watch all of the series. And when I found out that Doctor Who had been around as long as it had, and there were that many episodes, and my natural instinct is, of course, to go to the beginning. I'll start at the beginning. But then when you go and you look at the beginning was 1963, guys, 1963. And it's black and white, and it's, it's a little rough. It's pretty rough. And the first Doctor was a rough Doctor. He was way more serious of an actor. It was less comedy. It was very interesting the way it was done. But coming as a first time viewer of Doctor Who, if I intend on watching it and I want to start from the beginning, first off, so long ago, so many episodes. Those first. Now the way how do I explain this? Like, when I watched Doctor Who and I went back later on and watched them, like the originals, I did. I've seen it all. But I didn't start there. And thank God I had a nerd who loved Doctor Who, a nerd friend, tell me not to start there. Because had I started with the original episodes, I wouldn't have watched it. I probably would not have watched Doctor Who have I started with the original stuff. Because not only is it black and white, it's from the 60s, 63, so special effects are ridiculous. But it was designed, they released it in bits. It wasn't one long episode. There were these little cut episodes. And it's so long, just so long, because there were these little bit episodes that they then weaved, that nowadays when we go back and watch it, they have weaved into episodes. But it's so long and so melodramatic and dark and black and white and weird. It doesn't have any of the gravitas. It doesn't have any of the comedy relief, for sure, that the newer stuff does. And by newer, I just mean like the 70s. Like, it just took them a couple of doctors to figure it out. And if you've never seen Doctor Who, obviously you don't know what I mean by a couple of doctors. But the point is, the amount of episodes is daunting. So that's one reason I think Americans first get a little thrown off. It definitely threw me off. I was like, shoot, I don't know. I'm going to want to watch it all. And the way my sci-fi friends talk about it, my Doctor Who friends talk about Doctor Who, they love it so much that what if I love it, then I'm going to have to watch all of these episodes. Oh my gosh. And it's one of those silly things that keeps you from doing it. Because I can tell you, having now watched all of Doctor Who, I absolutely love it. It's definitely my favorite, or one of my favorite sci-fi shows ever. 2, let's see. Number 2, when it comes to reasons why Americans have a tendency to overlook Doctor Who. How do I say this? It's British. Now, that's not an insult in any way, shape, or form, and I don't want British people to take it as an insult because I am a huge fan of British cinema. Guy Ritchie, almost not every film, but so many Guy Ritchie films are my absolute favorite films of all time. Lock, Stock, and Two Smoking Barrels, Snatch, Rock and Rolla. Great, amazing, ridiculous films. He did, for those of you who have no idea what I'm talking about, you remember a few years back when they made the Sherlock Holmes movies, and you had Robert Downey Jr. playing Sherlock Holmes. That was Guy Ritchie. That's his style, and it's great. It's amazing. It's action. Guy does amazing soundtracks. The soundtracks are always amazing to those movies. If you haven't seen any of those other movies I recommended, I really do recommend you watch. Start with Snatch. It's they're all very similar in the way that their storyline goes and things like that. The jumping around to crazy. It's all a bunch of crazy wackadoo stuff, but they're amazing. They're great movies. Monty Python. I can honestly say there's no way I would be the same person I am today. There's no way I would be Nicholas John Random without Monty Python. I'm pretty sure I could quote word for word every line in Holy Grail. Monty Python has been a ridiculous influence on my life. It's so British television and movies and things like that are fantastic. What I mean by when I say it's British, and that's why Americans don't want to give it. That's one of the reasons why Americans don't want to give it a shot. Is I need to put you in the mind of an American if you are British and you're listening to this. So when it comes to Americans, we have a tendency to think about British television or movies in basically one of the two ways that I just expressed. Either you are very Monty Python-esque in your shows, silly, quirky, little grimier, little, because that kind of thing. I'll give you an example. Is The Office. Everybody knows The Office, right? With Steve Carell and all that kind of stuff. But The Office isn't American. It was adapted from The Office, the British version of The Office. And if you compare the two, the setting's the same, the characters are the same, but The Office, the British version of The Office is much more gritty, and the jokes are a little dirtier, just kind of stuff like that. It's just a little bit off. So Americans have a tendency to think of, if it's comedy, they think of that kind of thing. They think of The Office or Monty Python-esque kind of stuff. If it's serious, they think of, like I said, they think of movies like the ones I just talked about, Snatch and Lock, Stock, and Two Smoking Barrels and things like that. Or serious British actors like, Idris Elba or Jason Statham or people like that, who are amazing, amazing actors, but they get serious and they get serious. So Americans have a tendency to think in those two point of views. Now, here's one thing that that might surprise British people. If you ask an American, what's the first thing that comes to mind when they think of British sci-fi television? Unless they're a Doctor Who fan, literally their mind is blank. Completely blank. Because I can tell you, as a huge, huge sci-fi fan, other than Doctor Who, and maybe, Sherlock or something like that, there is nothing that comes to mind when it's sci-fi and British. And that's not the fault of British cinema in any way, shape, or form. That's because we're American, and Americans produce so much content that British stuff and foreign stuff in general gets thrown to the side. Unless it's like top notch, it rarely reaches the shores of America. It just doesn't happen. So we just we don't have a spectrum for sci-fi and British. Unless you've seen Doctor Who, you have no spectrum whatsoever. So you ask that American, what do you think? So it's you, or you tell them, you're like, okay, So Doctor Who is this awesome sci-fi British show, and the first thing that the brain goes is like, well, what the heck is that? Like, what does that look like? It's sci-fi British. Is it sci-fi British in like the weird, cheesy Monty Python way, or is it sci-fi British, like super crazy, serious action film Jason Statham style? What does that mean? What does it mean? And their brains instantly kind of go to imagining cheesy sci-fi stuff, Monty Python style. That's just something that happens. And they're not far off. Let's be honest. Some of the stuff in the 70s and in the 80s when it comes to Doctor Who, definitely some cheesy aliens and such. But that's okay. That's that's sci-fi. If it exists in that time. I mean, come on, original series of Star Trek, some super, super cheesy stuff, man. Lost in Space. You can see zippers on the back of some of these monsters. I mean, it's ridiculous. So I think that's definitely a factor, is they don't know what to expect when you say that. So their brain goes to cheesy Monty Python, which, again, I love Monty Python and it's wonderful, but mixing Monty Python with sci-fi is tricky. It's tricky. I'll give you another example of where my brain goes before Doctor Who previously. Does everybody remember Monty Python's Life of Brian? Okay, well, in the Life of Brian, there's a random scene in the middle of the movie where an alien spacecraft crashes onto Earth. And it's all these silly, really cheesy, weird aliens in a cheesy, weird spaceship. That is what Americans' minds go to when you say it's a sci-fi show that's been around since the 60s. That's British. So that is a big step that we have to overcome. Let's see, what else do we got going on? Another here's number 3. This is a pretty normal one to understand, because it's an English television program. Access. Now, it is so much easier now than it used to be, obviously, but access to the show was always limited for Americans. Because I can think of one channel. There's been one channel back in the day that I would have been able to even find the show on if it happened to be on. And what's funny is most of the time, Star Trek was on that channel, which is the BBC channel. Star Trek Next Generation was on all the time when I was growing up on BBC. I rarely saw Doctor Who on there. And when it did, I didn't know what it was. And so, and if I saw it was Doctor Who, I was like, oh, I'm not just going to jump into a random episode of this show. So I didn't. So access has always been a big problem. Now, nowadays, again, we have all these formats. We have Amazon and Netflix and, all these channels on your TV that you can find. You can find Doctor Who now. But you didn't used to be able to. You had cable or satellite, and it was pretty hard to find Doctor Who. So that was definitely a big issue, access to the show itself. And then again, because of the access thing, and because of the first thing I talked about, which is wanting to watch the whole series, if you start Googling Doctor Who, you realize a couple of things, which is the original series, a lot of the episodes have been destroyed, and they don't have them anymore. The show was created in 1963, and a lot of those tapes were destroyed or recorded over or things like that, and they just don't exist anymore, which is sad. But it's also, like I said, the first Doctor, that original show in 1963 was pretty rough. Now it's cool and it started the entire thing off, but it's pretty rough. So here's what I'm going to say. Now moving on, those are the 3 key elements, I believe, to why Americans don't usually look for Doctor Who when it comes to something they want to start watching. But let's move on to why you should watch it, why you should give it a shot, or how you should give it a shot, I should say. So the way I was introduced to Doctor Who was because that's the first thing. So I had a bunch of friends that were like, you have to watch Doctor Who. It's amazing. It's awesome. It's wonderful. David Tennant is amazing. Oh my gosh. Well, they were right. David Tennant was amazing. So the principle behind Doctor Who, let's just start with some basic principles. The principle behind Doctor Who is the character called the Doctor. He's rarely called Doctor Who. He's just the Doctor. Is an alien. He is an alien from a distant world. And spoiler alert, he may or may not be one of the last of his kind due to some crazy shenanigans that went down. He has a mysterious past. You don't know a whole lot about what's going on. They keep trying to fill in little gaps here and there. But the Doctor has a spaceship called the TARDIS. The TARDIS can travel through space, but it can also travel anywhere in time. So not only is it a spaceship, but it's a time machine. It can travel anywhere in space and time. He usually travels with a few companions, side characters. You don't want to keep it boring. So he, like when the show started, he traveled with a little girl who, I got to be honest with you, that little girl wasn't little. She was in her 20s, and she was acting like she was a little girl, which is a little weird, but that's how television was in the 60s. You didn't cast the little kids. You got adults that looked young. So, but he, generally speaking, throughout the series, he has cast as his companions beautiful women. There's usually a beautiful woman and some other characters. And it's kind of stuck to that for a long time. There's always a beautiful woman and then some side characters. So he travels around, him and his friends, and they go through all sorts of crazy adventures. The best way to describe the show itself, in my opinion, is it's like if you took Star Trek and I don't know, maybe Stargate, because of the time travel, stuff like that, and it's an object that they have to travel in, and you took the writing of the Twilight Zone and mixed them all together, because that's the big difference with Doctor Who. So Doctor Who, yeah, like I said, he travels through space and time, and they go on all their adventures and stuff like that. Very similar to Star Trek, where they go on all these crazy adventures, and sometimes they go through black holes, and all of a sudden they're in the 1960s or something. It's very similar to that kind of thing, where they have all these wackadoo adventures with aliens and different crazy things, but the writing has a tendency to get really, really, really twisted, sometimes really, really dark, and scary. Sometimes there's a lot of bad guy scenarios that are very, very scary or interesting in that kind of way. So it reminds me of the Twilight Zone, where you're trying to figure out what's going on, and it's in a scary kind of a way a lot of times. But with certain doctors, the actors that have played the Doctor over the years, they bring in a fun quirkiness and comedy. So it's this weird mix of like comedy and mystery and science fiction and stuff like that. And the newer stuff, and when I say newer, I mean the 90s and beyond. The visuals, the special effects are great. Every once in a while, they'll bring in a bad guy for nostalgia purposes. Like they have a bad guy called the Cybermen that they bring in for nostalgia. There's a couple of bad guys they'll bring in. They have a bad guy called the Daleks. They bring in for nostalgia purposes mainly, because they look super, super cheesy, but they're super, super iconic to the actual show itself. But with the exception of them, the sci-fi special effects are amazing in the shows, and it's ridiculous. It can be very, very interesting. So it's a guy who travels through space and time on all sorts of crazy adventures with his friends. That's essentially the show. One of the most interesting factors, the reason it is the longest running show, the longest one single storyline show in history, is because of the creative work of the original writers. So, you have things like Star Trek. I keep going back to that because it's an easy example. You have things like Star Trek where you have the original series, and then you have Next Generation. And then after that, you have Deep Space Nine. And then after that, you have Voyager. These are the same universe. They're all in the Star Trek universe, but they're different shows about different groups of people in different places. Deep Space Nine is about the station, Deep Space Nine. Voyager is about a crew who got lost in a black hole and ended up in the Delta Quadrant. Doctor Who is about Doctor Who. It is about one guy, one alien, and it has always been about that one alien. That's it. And the way they get away with that, because there have been 14 if you consider the War Doctor, 14 different actors to play the Doctor. And there will be 15. There's a new guy coming out next year. There have been 14 different actors playing the Doctor. And the way they get away with the single storyline was very, very creative. Essentially, what happened was they made the original show. The original guy who played the Doctor character was very, very old. He was, his name was William Hartnell. He was an old guy, and he was an old guy. He was supposed to be old in the show, but he was a good actor. But the show went on for a little while, and he got older, and at some point he was too old to do the role, and needed to retire. So they wanted to bring in somebody else. So the writers created an out, a very, very smart out. So he's an alien. The Doctor, he looks human, but he is an alien. He is he's from a place called Gallifrey, which is a planet far, far away. It doesn't matter. We're not going to get into all that stuff. I'm just trying to get you to understand the basics. So he's an alien from this other planet. Anyway, his species, they have a couple different things about them that are slightly different than humans. For one thing, they have two hearts. They're very similar to us. They're bipedal. He looks like a guy. He has two hearts, and he has a regeneration cycle. So the aliens from his planet have a regeneration cycle, which means, they've tiptoed around this, which means they can regenerate their bodies to a new form when they're under extreme stress or die or about to die, like somebody shoots them in one of their two hearts or something, and they're dying. Their body can regenerate health-wise a certain number of times. And that's the part they've tiptoed around. Obviously, they want to keep the show going, so they're tiptoeing around how many times they can actually regenerate. But they use this in a very clever way with the show. You see, when Hartnell wanted to retire and they wanted to bring in a new actor, they wrote it into the show that something happened to him, and his body tried to regenerate, and when it regenerated, he becomes the second actor. He becomes the next actor. And they've kept that going for years and years and years. Anytime an actor was, had done several seasons and they were ready to stop and go do something else, or the studio decided they were ready to stop and go do something else, or any number of reasons, they would have an episode where something traumatic happens to the Doctor and he's either about to die or something like that, and his body regenerates into the new Doctor. And the concept is, it's the same character. He knows all the history. He knows everything that's gone on. But he's lived for a very, very long time. And so he has all those memories, of all of his lives. But he has a new personality. Like every time he regenerates, he's a new version of himself. He's a new version of the Doctor, which makes the show quirky and interesting, because then all of a sudden you have a new actor, and he doesn't have to have an excuse. Like, he's playing the same character, but he doesn't have to do the thing that actors do when they get replaced on TV shows, which is like, oh, you have to act just like that guy was acting, and we're going to put you in the wig and give you the fake mustache because he had a mustache, and we want you to look just like him. Doesn't that drive you nuts when you're watching a TV show and they replace an actor with somebody else, or a movie, and the second one comes out and they replace an actor or an actress, and you're like, that's not the same person, and they're acting like that person as a mimic. It's always disheartening. So they don't have to do that in Doctor Who. They get regeneration happens. They put on new clothes. They dress different. They have the same character, so they have the same tools, and they always get companions and travel in the TARDIS, the spaceship that he has, and all that kind of stuff. But but he's a new personality. It's like a new personality has developed, which then is why you have Doctor Who fans who have their favorite doctors over the years, and you have, their least favorite doctors and things like that. There have been 13 different actors, 14 if you count John Hurt, who is one of my favorite actors of all time, by the way. He played a character called the War Doctor, which most people don't include in the line of the doctors. They say there's been 13 doctors, but with John Hurt, there's technically been 14 doctors. And now there will be another doctor coming out next year. The very last rendition of the Doctor was the first female Doctor that we've had on the show. And personally, I think she did amazing. Her name was Jodie Whittaker, the actress. I think she did a phenomenal job as the Doctor herself. I think the acting on her part was amazing. Unfortunately, a lot of the writers left whenever she came on board, and the writing took a big, big, big negative. And now that she's leaving and another guy's coming in to replace her, some of those writers are coming back. So she kind of got, the raw end of the deal there, but she did an amazing job. David Tennant is a lot of people's favorite, and personally, my two favorite doctors that have been David Tennant and Jodie Whittaker, because they bring a little bit of the wild, funny quirkiness that makes the show interesting. Like, even when crazy, terrible things are going on, they're a little quirky, and it's like having a crazy guy in the laboratory. If anybody's ever seen the show Fringe, another sci-fi, American sci-fi show, the character of Walter, he got out of a mental institution, yet he's the scientific genius that they rely on constantly. So he's just wacky. He'll be in the middle of some crazy conversation and then be like, "Oh, damn it, I'm out of peanut M&Ms." And they're like, "Dude, what are you talking about?" Like, he's just crazy and fun, and it's interesting. Well, Doctor Who is very similar to that. It's this quirky, weird, fun kind of thing. If you're going to try and watch it, do what I did and what I was suggested to do, which is, so they made, Doctor Who ran for a really, really long time. It started in 1963, and it ran into the 80s, and then it was canceled. They, believe it or not, the Americans decided they wanted to pick it up as a TV show, and not everybody was on board. So what happened was, in 1996, well, technically 1995, the studios were going to give permission to the American television networks to put out Doctor Who, but they wanted to test the audience first, so they made a made-for-TV movie about Doctor Who, which people do include in the canon, and that Doctor is the 8th Doctor in the line. But because, again, they didn't want to interrupt the storyline. That's the cool thing about this show, is it's just a one continuous storyline. But so they made a TV movie, American made-for-TV movie of Doctor Who. In 1996, it was released. It's not great. It's not terrible, but it's not great. And it didn't get the traction that people thought it would in America, so they decided not to make that TV show. And then in 2005, they decided to bring it back. Special effects technology had gotten a lot better, obviously. So in 2005, leaving off where the movie that was made in 96 had come out, they moved on to the 9th Doctor, and they had an actor, some of you may recognize him, named Christopher Eccleston. Christopher Eccleston came on and restarted the show in 2005. Now, this is where I suggest everybody start, is 2005. This is the beginning of the new genre of Doctor Who. Now, if you start watching the show and you love it and you want to go back and watch those old episodes, definitely do. With the older stuff, the stuff that was made in between 1963 and 1989, those shows are very, it was a lot of different things were going on in television to change. Like, you have a switch from black and white to color, and then you have, the 70s and the 80s and things like that are going on. So the television is constantly changing. That's a lot of time. That's 3 decades of television changes. So if you do go back and watch the old stuff after you like this show, I recommend starting, go back, just switch it around a little bit. You don't have to keep consistent when it comes to the older stuff. The new stuff, you want to stay in line. But the old stuff, you can it's like going back and watching a Star Trek episode. You can pick a random episode and watch it and it's totally fine. Whereas if you're going to go back and watch a Next Generation episode, you can watch episodes and it's totally fine. But there's a underlining, just like modern television does nowadays, there's an underlining storyline that flows throughout the whole series. So if you're going to go back and watch some stuff, start in 1974. Tom Baker, he's great. But if you're going to watch this for the first time, if you're going to start watching Doctor Who for the first time, I recommend starting in 2005 with Christopher Eccleston. Now, Christopher, unlike a lot of doctors, only played the role for 1 year. It wasn't for him, and he was just. I like to think of him as the kindling for the show because he started it off and he did a great job. But he's if you've ever seen him in anything, he's a very serious actor. I'm trying to think of what Americans may recognize him from. I can only think of a couple of things that you might recognize him for. If you saw years ago Gone in 60 Seconds, not the original, but the one with Nicolas Cage, great movie. He plays the bad guy. That's that guy. He also played a bad guy, and he does a lot of bad guys. He gets typecasted. He was also the bad guy, and a few years ago they made a G.I. Joe movie, quite silly, with Channing Tatum. But he's the bad guy character, and he kind of has that gravitas and facial features of a bad guy. So I don't know whose decision it was for him to leave after 1 year, but he did a great job, and it starts the show off, and it's a good way to start. You have to start with 2005's season in order to start the storyline off. I think he was a little too serious for the show to where they wanted to go. He was trying to be a little too, it's 2005, but he's very like 90s, like action hero kind of guy, when they wanted something a little more quirky and fun. So he did 1 season, and then following him was David Tennant. And this is universally, generally known as people's favorite Doctor. There's one other guy who's the contender, and that's the guy who came after him. But David Tennant is definitely probably my favorite Doctor. He just did a great job, and he took the role on for a long time. He did it from 2005 to 2010. People loved him so much that they kind of skewed the whole Regeneration thing with him. When he should have left, he stayed on. After that, we had a guy named Matt Smith come on, who was a completely different kind of personality, completely different look. And it took a little bit for me to like that guy, but he did a great job in a totally different kind of way. After that, we had Peter Capaldi. Peter Capaldi, again, same thing. And this is what's interesting about the show, is each time, every few years when they switch the Doctor up to a new person, totally different kind of vibe. The show takes on a different kind of vibe. You had, when David Tennant was on, it was fun, quirky, and adventurous and interesting. When Matt Smith came on, it was weird and strange and kind of like Twilight Zone-y with the things going down. When Peter Capaldi came on, again, we went back to that more serious, still cool and interesting, but very serious kind of Doctor character. Following him, we have Jodie Whittaker, which is the first female person to ever play a Doctor. And she goes very much back to that David Tennant. Her personality is very much David Tennant, where she's quirky and fun and interesting and young and youthful and, all sorts of crazy stuff. I really liked her performance. And after her, we're going to get this new guy who I can't pronounce his name. I think his last name is Gatwa. He'll be the first black person to play the Doctor. So we've got you know, there's a lot to watch, but it is really, really a great show. And if you're gonna watch it, I recommend you start, like I said, with Christopher Eccleston in 2005. It starts off the series, and it keeps you going. Great show. I don't know what else I can say about it. It's like I said, for you Americans out there who just won't give it a shot. Trust me, I was one of you guys for a really, really long time, and I did, and it is one of my favorite shows. And they do Christmas special. They do the shows, and then they do Christmas specials and things like that, and it's really great. Great bad guys, great special effects, great characters. I definitely recommend you give it a shot. Well, I think that's going to be it for this episode, guys. I hope if you were listening to this and you were a sci-fi fan who was just curious about what the heck is going on with Doctor Who and should you give it a shot, I hope you do give it a shot. Like I said, I didn't for many, many years, and I did, and now I love the show. If you're just somebody trying to convince an American to watch Doctor Who, look, guys, I hope you actually listened and are now going to give it a shot. It's a really good show. Not sure what else we can say today. So if you like the show, click the like button down there. If you want to support the show and keep the lights on for us, you can head over to our Patreon account, which is Patreon/Random Radio, and subscribe. And you may get some goodies and some preview episodes of the show for us. If you have a question that you'd like turned into an episode, I love a good question. You guys know that. So send your questions either in the comments or directly to my email, which is at random@cafestimulus.com. You can send me a question on Patreon. You can send me a question any way you can get a question to me. If it's a really good one, we will do a show about it. I love good questions, and I love answering anything. And it can be about anything, guys. Anything in the world. You want to learn how to play golf? I'll do my best. But thank you for joining us here. Once again, we are coming from you live at Stimulus Cafe and Coffee House in beautiful Durango, Colorado. Great spot if you ever want to come by and grab a cup of coffee or a tasty treat and you're in the area. Durango is beautiful. And we will catch you next time on Random Radio. Until then, you guys have a wonderful, wonderful rest of your day.